so it developed into this idea that maybe you could just have the back of the truck detachable from the chassis, from the cab, and just ship the container.
Well, first, I wonder if you could tell us about Malcolm McLean's early life, where he was born, something about his family and his upbringing.
Malcolm McLean was born in Maxton, North Carolina, then quite a small town. And it was a rural area, and his family had a, I think, fairly typical lifestyle of that time. His father had sometimes worked for the post office and sometimes did other things and sometimes farmed to make a living. That was sort of the practice. McLean came of age during the Great Depression. Finished high school, and the question was, what do you do now when jobs are hard to find? And so he originally purchased a truck and was hauling stuff around his neighborhood, hauled gasoline to a gas station not far away, and that sort of thing. During the New Deal, with a lot of federally funded public works, he started hauling stuff on public works projects, got a couple of trucks. And so that's really how he got his beginnings in the 1930s. And then he decided to build a trucking company. His company was called McLean Trucking, and initially it hauled things around North Carolina, and then gradually expanded over a broader area. I've got to inject here that the federal government began to regulate interstate trucking in 1935. So before that time, anybody could be in the trucking business and pretty much go where they wanted across state lines. Many of the states had regulated trucking earlier than that. But after the federal government started to regulate trucking under the Interstate Commerce Commission, then truckers needed to be able to justify their service. They were only allowed to serve approved routes. They needed to prove that the public convenience and necessity, that was the legal terminology, required their service. So you couldn't just start going a new place or carrying a new commodity. The commodities that a truck line could carry had to be approved by the Interstate Commerce Commission. The rates charged had to be approved by the ICC. And the ICC was very concerned about the stability of the industry. What that meant was that they didn't want anybody coming in, starting up a trucking company or charging unprofitably low rates, because that would drive other truckers out of business, and the ICC thought that it was part of its job to keep the industry stable. So the only way that you could really gain market share as a trucker was to keep your costs lower than other truckers. And McLean really focused on that, developing efficiencies in trucking. He gradually developed routes between the Southeast and the Northeast, New York and New England, carrying textiles, tobacco, different things like that. But he, for example, was very early in striking deals with certain fuel stations along the route. So he could get diesel fuel more cheaply than perhaps other trucking companies can. He had built some innovative terminals early on to reduce the cost of cargo handling. All of this was meant so that he could go to the ICC and ask for lower rates than competitors were charging and prove to the ICC that these rates would still be profitable. And McLean was very successful at this. He built his business to the point that by the early 1950s, McLean Trucking was one of the largest trucking companies in the country.
Now, I was reading in the New York Times obituary for Mr. McLean, and I don't know if you can confirm this or not, but they had mentioned that McLean Trucking was one of the first, not the first, but one of the first to actually use diesel fuel for trucks. Can you tell us something about that?
My understanding is that that's true. Diesel technology was not particularly new, but there was a a whole question of how you can make it adaptable for trucks. Can you make it have the engines big enough to move truckloads of freight? And of course, there's this whole network issue. And nobody is going to want to use diesel fuel unless they can be assured that they can get it where they're going. So McLean was an early buyer of diesel fuel trucks. And for a period of time, I think that gave him an advantage in the marketplace. Obviously, the rest of the industry followed suit before too long.
You mentioned that he continued with McLean Trucking up until the mid 1950s, and it was at that point that many people credit him with, as they put it, the invention of the shipping container. And you were mentioning before we went on air, that's not exactly the truth. Can you kind of explain what his part was in terms of the shipping container economy as we have it today?
Sure. McLean absolutely did not invent the shipping container. Okay, the idea that you should take a lot of small packages and put them into a big box in order to save money in transport costs was not really a new idea with Malcolm McLean. This had been around since the 1700s. You can find drawings of canal boats in the United States where the freight compartment would separate from the rest of the boat and could be moved and put on another canal boat on the other side of the mountain. That sort of thing. By the 1920s, many US railroads were using containers. And in Europe, railroads were using containers. These were typically much smaller than today's containers. But the main thing from the railroad's point of view was that they wanted these to be proprietary. Okay. They didn't want to let their container go to anybody else. So typically, a railroad would set up an arrangement with a truck line to carry a certain kind of container. It would only fit on this railroad's freight cars. It would only fit on this truck line's bed. And so you could ship via container, but you couldn't interchange the container. You couldn't send something from Kansas City to New York, partially on the Missouri Pacific and then partially on the Pennsylvania Railroad. That didn't happen, okay, because everybody figured this was a way to keep the business for themselves. The Interstate Commerce Commission, which I mentioned earlier was the regulator, was not helpful here. The reason was that freight rates were based on commodity, and many shipping containers that were used in the 1930s had several different commodities inside. This was a problem for the ICC because truckers and railroads were not supposed to charge on the basis of a container. They were supposed to charge on what was inside the container. And in fact, the ICC ended up telling the railroad in the first of these cases that went to the commission that this container was a great idea, but if you wanted to use it, the railroad had to open the container, see what was inside, and then that would determine the rate that would be charged for shipping the goods in the container, which rather defeated the purpose of a shipping container. Okay, there was no savings because you had to haul the stuff out from inside and figure out what all was in there. The containers that were used in Europe, they were usually wood containers. Often they were covered with canvas. The European railroads had an international container bureau that tried to promote containers in the 1930s, but it was just of a very small scale by modern standards. And there were some things that really held us up. I mean, imagine you've created a container, whether you've built it out of wood or you've made it out of steel, you put goods in it, you ship them somewhere. What do you do with the container? Okay, if it's wood, you can burn it. If it's metal, you've got to either ship it back empty or find somebody to send something in it or use it as a storage shed, in which case then you have to add the cost of making the container to the cost of the shipment. So all of these things really got into the way. So that gets us back to Malcolm McLean. McLean was not the inventor of the container. McLean was dealing with a problem with his trucking company, which is that after World War II, there was a huge increase in automobile sales in the United States. There were a lot more cars on the road. McLean ran his trucks between the Southeast and the Northeast on roads that were generally not yet turnpikes, not yet limited access highways, and things were slowing down. Okay, there was too much traffic, and so his trucks were taking too long to make this trip. Of course, that raised his costs and affected his rates, and really was bad for business. And so his idea in the early 1950s was, suppose you could just take this truck and put it on a ship, put it on a ship in New York, sail the ship down the coast to Carolina, take it off ship in Carolina, and it would go to its destination. This was a technology that had actually been used during World War II. It was not a new concept. McLean worked on it for a while, and he realized it didn't really make much sense to put a truck on a ship because there was a lot of waste space. So then he figured out, suppose you detach the cab and just put the chassis with the freight compartment on the ship. And looked at that for a while and then realized, well, you could do that, but then you could only have one layer of containers because you couldn't stack the chassis. And so it developed into this idea that maybe you could just have the back of the truck detachable from the chassis, from the cab, and just ship the container. And that's what he did for the first time in 1956.
So
So the container's start was really quite prosaic. Okay, Malcolm McLean was trying to avoid traffic jams because they were hurting the profitability of his company. So subsequently, there's been a lot of stuff about how he was setting out to change the world and so on and so forth. And that's not true at all. He was trying to solve a very concrete problem that his company was facing.
so is it accurate to say that because of what he did in order to solve this problem for himself, did that lead to the standardization of shipping containers that we have today?
Well, so McLean, I should tell people, was forced to sell his truck line in order to make use of containers. The Interstate Commerce Commission frowned upon companies owning different types of transportation. That was a no-no. So he could be in the trucking business, but not then also in the domestic shipping business. And so finally, he decided to take a big bet. He sold his company, McLean Trucking, made a good bit of money on it, and plowed it all into this untested technology, which was the shipping container. He started originally in 1956 with 33-foot containers because that was the biggest size that could be attached to a truck to go on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And then he switched to 35-foot containers. There were a bunch of imitators. There were other companies that started container service. Matson Line used containers between the Pacific coast and Hawaii. They did really careful stuff on that a 35-foot container would be too heavy. Their biggest cargo is canned pineapple from Hawaii, and that a 35-foot container of canned pineapple would be too heavy for a crane to lift. So they came up with 20-foot long containers. And there was another company that had 17-foot containers and so forth. The ships in that day were often financed by the US government. And the trade-off was that the government had the right to demand the use of these ships in times of war. And so we had here the Military Sealift Command coming to the shipping industry and the rail industry and the trucking industry saying, what are we supposed to do with this? If we have a war, we get to commandeer all these ships. But some of these ships are going to take 17-foot containers, and some of them are going to take 35-foot containers, and some are going to take 20-foot containers. And how can we run a war like that? And so that set off a process of negotiating standards, first in the United States and then internationally. And this process went on for almost a decade. It started in the late 1950s. And I tell people that the guys who negotiated this stuff were, in a way, the heroes of the shipping container story, because you have to imagine spending 10 years sitting in smoke-filled rooms talking about how thick the end wall of a container should be. And that's what we're talking about. It's not just the size of the container that needed to be standardized. It was, for example, how many supports should there be inside the container? Okay. That's not very important to, say, truckers, because they're only carrying a single container. If you've got a ship, that's really important because you may want to stack containers several high, and so they've got to be really strong. So the interests of the different parties involved in this were very different. And it took a lot of negotiating before there was an agreement on what today is the standard 40-foot container.
Okay. Why do you think it is that Malcolm McLean's name figures so prominently in this story, that he is credited, however inaccurately, with inventing the shipping container? What was it about him that kind of made that the narrative, you think?
Well, for people like a good story. And I think Malcolm McLean did remarkable things here. Okay. Just invention was not what he did with the shipping container. What he did was really find a way to make this rather old technology financially viable. Okay. People had experimented with this for a long time and had never figured out a way to make any money out of it. Really, McLean's greatest contribution, in my view, was what he taught the industry that we now refer to as logistics. He, coming into the maritime industry from a background as a trucker, he said to people, nobody cares about your ship. Nobody cares about your train or your truck. People are interested in getting their cargo from here to there on time as cheaply as possible. And so forget about all the romance of the sea, forget about the romance of the rails, focus on your customer. And today, that doesn't seem so important, but you have to put yourself back in the regulated environment of the mid 1950s, when trucks were trucks and trains were trains and ships were ships. And these were totally separate businesses in the eyes of the industry, in the eyes of the regulator, in the eyes of Congress. They didn't have much to do with each other. And McLean said, this is not how you serve your customers. And that's a substantial accomplishment. I mean, retrospectively, looking back today, you really can't appreciate how much that has changed the way that the logistics industry does business.
Now, as I understand it, when he started his work with shipping containers, he bought, as you mentioned, he sold his trucking company. He went into this, and his first ship was an old World War II tanker.
Right.
And I'm kind of curious, can you tell us something about that? What gave him the idea of maybe a ship that would be set up specifically to haul large numbers of these containers?
Well, so he had this concept of putting freight into a container. He was willing to bet his own money on it. In those days, there were a lot of leftover ships from World War II that belonged to the U.S. government. These were, people will have heard of Liberty ships. Many of these were Liberty ships. There were hundreds of T2 tankers left over. These were fairly small tankers that were meant to ferry gasoline or oil across the Atlantic. And so McLean was able to buy two of these tankers at very little cost. And he had his people put a frame above the deck of the tanker called a spar deck. And this frame was meant to hold 58 containers. That was the initial attempt. Why? Well, partially the tankers were available. Partially, if this container thing didn't work out, he could always transport oil in the tankers. So that's the first container ship, was a converted tanker, which carried 58 33-foot containers. By today's standards, an extremely small load. But that was okay because remember that the rest of the infrastructure needed to handle containers really didn't exist either. So the containers were lifted onto this ship by just an old-fashioned whirly crane. Okay, nothing like the accuracy of a modern container crane that can load a container every 30 seconds. Uh, so they couldn't have handled a large ship. It was just the whole technology was not there. There were not a lot of ports that were set up to handle containers. I mean, there was a whole evolution that had to occur here before the container could be widely used.
Um, Following this, this was when he purchased, as I understand it, a company called Pan Atlantic Steamship Company,
That's right.
changed the name to Sealand, but he eventually sold that, as I understand it, to R.J. Reynolds. Um, what happened with McLean after that?
Well, so McLean had bought Pan Atlantic because he needed operating rights. And again, to take you back into the 1950s, you couldn't just travel between here and there. You couldn't, if you wanted to run a ship between these two points on the US coast, you needed permission from the Interstate Commerce Commission. And the easiest way to get it was to purchase a company that already had it. And so that's why he purchased Pan Atlantic Steamship. And then he later purchased Waterman Steamship. Same reason initially. Um, this was really dictated by regulation. And so he changed the name to Sealand Service and built this company. It was the largest container shipping line in the world, which did not mean a whole lot in the 1950s and early 1960s because there were not that many containers around. But this business grew and it became a solid business only after standardization. Okay, once there was an agreement on the standard size, then companies started building larger ships to travel the Atlantic. That's when container shipping started to become an international business. And McLean himself introduced containers, persuaded the military to try container ships to supply troops during the Vietnam War. So that's at the point at which this really became a big international business. And McLean had run it for a good number of years. R.J. Reynolds, it's a cigarette company, tobacco company. It spun off lots of money. It wanted to expand into other things. And the container shipping industry, people thought, was it going to be a go-go industry? I mean, there were other go-go industries at the time. Your older listeners will remember, when Xerox was a go-go company, and there were some others. And so here was this idea. So they spent a lot of money. They bought Sealand Service. McLean stayed with R.J. Reynolds for a while. He was not really a corporate guy. He didn't want to deal with somebody else's corporate bureaucracy. And R.J. Reynolds decided after a while that this was not a terrific fit because this wasn't like Xerox. This was really a commodity business. And the loads were determined really by the state of the world economy. And so it was very cyclical. Rates climbed, it was very profitable, then rates crashed, and all of a sudden it was losing money hand over fist. And by the way, that's when you needed to explain to your shareholders why you were buying new ships, even though rates were really low and you were losing a ton of money. And so they eventually decided they didn't want to be in the container shipping business either.
Now, McLean went on. I know that he briefly took over another shipping company, which didn't make it. But then in 1992, and now we're almost 60 years after he started in trucking, he founded a company called Trailer Bridge.
Right.
Is this something in the same business, or what can you tell us about that company?
Well, yeah. So McLean, personality-wise, McLean was a guy who loved the competition part of business. Okay, he didn't need to make another dollar. He had plenty of money, but after he sold his company to R.J. Reynolds, he got bored. He wanted to be in the game. He wanted to be doing things. He bought United States Lines, which was the biggest U.S. flag shipping lines, an international carrier. Wanted to build its container business. made some bad bets. He was not the first and he was not the last to make bad bets on container shipping. And eventually, US lines went bankrupt in the late 1980s. It was at the time the biggest bankruptcy in US history. And McLean he was very ashamed of this because a lot of people had lost their jobs and he felt responsible for all of this. And so he kind of isolated himself for a while and then got enticed to come back into business with this company called Trailer Bridge, which was running containers basically between Florida and Puerto Rico. So it's a much smaller company, a company that sometimes was profitable, sometimes not, but he just needed to be engaged. This was not somebody, at this point in time, he was not young and he could easily have retired, but this was not him. Uh, he needed to be in there competing. In my book, The Box, which is the story of the container, I have a quote from someone who worked with him, who made the comment to me that you couldn't go quail hunting with Malcolm without betting on who was going to have the first, the most, the biggest. And that was a very insightful comment because that's how this guy was. He was just competitive and he wanted to be in the game. And so that's how he ended up back in the business at an age when he really didn't need to be in business at all.